I was standing near the sideboard when it happened, my back straight, my hands resting on a thin clipboard I hadn't put down yet. The room was already full. The house manager sat closest to the window. Two agency representatives were beside him. Everyone had arrived on time. She didn't lower her voice. "Let's be clear," she said, looking directly at me. "You're not staff in the way you seem to think. You're the maid." "That's it?" The word landed hard because she let it. No pause, no embarrassment. She wanted it heard. There were others in the room, two junior staff members, her brother, the HR assistant from the agency. No one interrupted. A few eyes dropped to the table. Someone adjusted their chair. She slid a single page across the table with her fingertips. "Your role is changing, fewer hours, lower rate. You'll sign this today or we'll find someone else." I didn't move toward the paper. She smiled, the kind that assumes agreement before it's given. "You should be grateful," she added. "People like you don't usually get this kind of opportunity." The house manager cleared his throat, then stopped. The agency representative glanced at me once, then back at his notes. I stayed where I was. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like everyone was waiting to see if I would explain myself. I didn't. I looked at the page on the table, the new terms, the revised title, the signature line waiting at the bottom. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, she leaned back and said, "Well, we don't have all day." I let the silence sit a moment longer before the meeting moved on without me saying a word. My name is Amina Akoy. I was 34 at the time, living on the south side of the city, close enough to walk to the agency office when I needed to. I'd been working steadily for years, mostly in private households where discretion mattered more than charm. I was hired through a licensed domestic staffing agency, paid on record, and cleared through the same background checks as everyone else in that room. I handled schedules, inventory, and vendor access because I was reliable with details and didn't miss things. When something broke, I logged it. When something changed, I wrote it down. The house itself wasn't unfamiliar to me. I'd been there before dawn and after midnight, often alone, trusted with keys, alarms, and routines other people never saw. It was work I knew how to do well, and I treated it like any other professional responsibility. What made the moment unfair wasn't the title she used. It was the imbalance behind it. I wasn't responsible only for cleaning. I managed the weekly supply orders, coordinated vendor access, tracked deliveries, and logged expenses that passed through the house. When staff called in sick, I adjusted schedules. When guests stayed late, I stayed later. When something went missing, I was the one asked to account for it. None of that had been disputed before. It was expected. The agreement I signed at the start was clear about hours, compensation, and scope. Over time, the scope expanded. The compensation didn't. Responsibilities were added quietly, one at a time, framed as temporary favors or just this once requests. I said yes because the work needed to be done and I did it correctly. What changed that day wasn't my performance. It was their decision to reframe my role publicly, to reduce it in front of witnesses, and to attach new terms without discussion. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a removal of standing. There had been smaller moments like this before, comments made casually, assumptions spoken out loud, corrections delivered as jokes. The pattern wasn't sudden, it was consistent. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about fairness and about the difference between agreement and exploitation. I looked down at the clipboard in my hands, not because I needed to read it, but because it gave the room something to wait on. The revised agreement stayed on the table between us, untouched. The pen beside it hadn't rolled. No one reached for it. Silence stretched, controlled and clean. I didn't fill it. I didn't explain. I let the quiet do what talking would have undone. Eventually, the house manager shifted in his seat. Someone checked the time. The meeting continued, but the balance in the room had already changed. The changes to my role didn't start that day. They had been happening gradually in ways that were easy to overlook if you weren't tracking them. At first, it was access. I was given responsibility for vendor schedules because you're already here when they arrive. Then it was inventory because you know what we use. I began signing off on deliveries, confirming invoices, and coordinating repairs directly with outside contractors. None of it came with a new title. None of it came with revised pay. When the house manager traveled, the messages came to my phone instead of his. If there was a late arrival, I stayed. If a guest extended their visit, I adjusted the rotation. When staff argued about shifts, I resolved it and sent the update to the agency myself. This wasn't framed as authority, it was framed as convenience. Each added task was presented as temporary, practical, or necessary. Just until things settle, just for this month. You're better at handling this. I didn't object because the work still needed to be done, and leaving it undone would have caused problems for everyone else. What never changed were the records. My pay statements stayed the same. My title stayed the same. The formal agreement remained untouched even as the expectations around it quietly expanded. By the time the public correction happened in that meeting, the gap between what I was doing and how I was being described had already grown wide. No one questioned it because the system benefited from the silence. The way they treated me wasn't isolated, and it wasn't unique. I saw it in how instructions changed depending on who was listening. Requests became orders when witnesses were present. Praise was given privately, then walked back in front of others. When mistakes happened, responsibility traveled downward quickly and without discussion. Other staff noticed it too, though no one spoke about it directly. Schedules were adjusted without notice. Hours disappeared from pay periods and reappeared later as misunderstandings. If someone questioned it, the response was always the same: polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. I was often used as the point of contact when problems needed to be absorbed quietly. If a vendor complained about late payment, I was asked to smooth it out. If a guest made a request outside policy, I was expected to accommodate it and explain it later. When boundaries were crossed, they were framed as flexibility issues, not violations. This wasn't chaos. It was a system that relied on unequal pressure. The family spoke often about loyalty and trust, usually when asking for something extra. Authority was asserted selectively, and accountability was redistributed downward when it became inconvenient to hold it at the top. Over time, it became clear that compliance was rewarded with more responsibility, not respect. Silence wasn't interpreted as professionalism. It was interpreted as permission. I didn't decide to act out of anger. There wasn't a moment of outrage or resolve that needed naming. What changed was simpler than that. I stopped assuming the structure would correct itself. After the meeting, I reviewed the agreement I'd signed when I was hired. I read it once, then again more carefully. The language was specific about scope, reporting lines, and change procedures. None of the recent adjustments had followed those steps. They had been implemented through habit and expectation, not process. I began saving things I had previously trusted others to track: pay statements, schedule revisions, messages confirming responsibilities that didn't exist on paper. I organized them by date, nothing more, no commentary, no conclusions. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for accuracy. When I reached out for clarification, I did it in writing. When responses were delayed, I noted the delay. When instructions changed verbally, I followed up with a neutral confirmation. Everything stayed factual. Everything stayed calm. I didn't change how I worked. I changed how I documented. The first calls didn't lead anywhere quickly. I left messages that were returned days later, usually with a request to send an email so we have it on file. When I did, the replies came back carefully worded and incomplete. I contacted the agency to ask how role changes were supposed to be handled. They forwarded me to payroll. Payroll forwarded me to compliance. Compliance asked for copies of agreements I already had. I sent them as PDFs labeled by date and waited. There were delays that had nothing to do with resistance and everything to do with routine. Offices closed early. Calendars filled up. One meeting was rescheduled twice because the reviewer was traveling. None of it felt dramatic. It felt procedural. I spent one afternoon in a small waiting area outside the agency office, seated between a filing cabinet and a water dispenser that hummed every few minutes. When my name was called, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. I was asked neutral questions. I gave neutral answers. They didn't offer opinions, they asked for documentation. I followed up with written summaries after each interaction, short and factual. Per our discussion, as requested. For confirmation, I attached records and waited again. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing. No conclusions were drawn. What became clear slowly was that the situation couldn't be assessed through conversation alone. It had to move through channels one step at a time with everything in order. That was fine with me. Verification took longer than the initial review. Each department confirmed only what fell inside its own scope, and nothing moved forward until those confirmations lined up. Compliance requested time-stamped schedules. Payroll asked for original statements instead of summaries. Legal wanted the initial agreement, the unsigned revisions, and proof of when responsibilities had changed. I provided everything exactly as requested without emphasis or explanation. There was friction, but it was administrative, not adversarial. One file was rejected because the scan wasn't clear enough. Another had to be resent because the attachment name didn't match the reference number. A reviewer asked me to clarify whether a message had been sent before or after a specific date. I checked the metadata and replied with the timestamp. Each step slowed the process, but it also narrowed it. I didn't follow up aggressively. I waited for responses and logged when they arrived. When a week passed without one, I sent a short reminder. When I was told something would be reviewed soon, I asked what that meant in writing. Nothing escalated. It didn't need to. By the end of that phase, there was no disagreement about the facts themselves. There were only questions about how those facts interacted with existing structures. That was the point where the matter stopped being personal altogether. The leverage wasn't something I created in response to what happened. It had existed long before the meeting, for reasons that had nothing to do with me personally. Several years earlier, the family had restructured parts of their business operations to limit exposure and centralize oversight. Staffing, payroll coordination, and vendor access were routed through an external entity tied to their primary holdings. It was a practical decision, made to reduce risk and standardize reporting. At the time, no one paid much attention to who controlled that structure, only that it functioned. What changed quietly months before the confrontation was the authorization attached to it. Through a routine administrative update, one triggered by a retirement and finalized after a review period, the authority to approve, suspend, or renegotiate staffing contracts shifted. It didn't move suddenly, and it wasn't announced broadly. The change was logged, recorded, and filed the same way hundreds of similar adjustments were each year. I was named in that update as an authorized signatory, acting in a professional capacity, not a personal one. The designation came with clear limits and clear responsibility. It wasn't reversible through conversation or preference. Only formal process could alter it. I didn't accelerate anything after the meeting. I didn't make demands. I completed the remaining paperwork that had already been scheduled and allowed the system to recognize what was already in place. From the outside, it may have looked like a reversal. It wasn't. It was alignment. The structure did what it was designed to do once everything was properly documented and confirmed. The meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning and held in a glass-walled conference room on the 8th floor. Everyone arrived early. The atmosphere was orderly, professional, and deliberately neutral. 2 legal representatives were already seated when I entered. A compliance officer joined them, arranging documents into neat stacks at the center of the table. The agency director took the seat closest to the door. No one spoke right away. I sat down where I was directed and placed my folder on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. The family arrived together, confident and casual, as if this were another routine discussion that would end in clarification and dismissal. One of them nodded at me without recognition. Another checked their phone and muted it. The compliance officer began by outlining the purpose of the meeting in plain terms. There would be a review, certain confirmations would be made, any questions would be addressed after the documentation was presented. No accusations were stated, no outcomes were implied. Printed copies were passed around the table one set at a time. The agency director confirmed receipt, legal counsel confirmed scope. Each step was acknowledged aloud, methodically, without commentary. I remained still, hands folded, listening. Before anyone else spoke, the compliance officer verified identities and authority for the record. Titles were read. Roles were confirmed. The room settled into the kind of quiet that comes when procedure takes precedence over assumption. That was when the review formally began. The compliance officer spoke first, reading directly from the document in front of him. Dates were confirmed. Reference numbers were stated out loud. Each item was tied back to an existing policy or agreement already on record. Legal counsel followed, clarifying scope. The review was limited to staffing authority, contractual compliance, and authorization thresholds. Nothing outside those boundaries would be discussed. The language was precise and unembellished. When my name was read, it was done without emphasis. The designation attached to it was stated the same way professionally without commentary, authorized signatory, effective date confirmed. Supporting documentation acknowledged as complete. The agency director nodded once and confirmed alignment. Their role in the process was administrative, not discretionary. They were there to implement the outcome of the review, not to negotiate it. No one objected. There was nothing to object to yet. The family listened, still confident, still assuming the conversation would pivot back to them. One of them leaned forward slightly, ready to interrupt, then stopped when legal counsel raised a hand. The officer continued, moving through the checklist. Each confirmation tightened the structure around the room. With every point verified, the space for argument narrowed. By the time the final authority confirmation was stated for the record, the framework was already complete. Nothing had been decided aloud, but the process had locked itself into place. The reaction didn't come all at once. It started with confusion. "That can't be right," she said, flipping through the pages as if a different version might appear. "We would have known about this." Her brother laughed once, short and dismissive. "She's staff," he said, gesturing toward me without looking. "You're telling us she has authority over anything?" Legal counsel didn't respond. The compliance officer waited. She pushed the papers back across the table. "There's been a mistake. This was never agreed to. Someone misunderstood their role." Her voice was firm, practiced, the kind used to ending discussions. The agency director asked her to point to the clause she was disputing. She didn't. Instead, she turned toward me. "You didn't say any of this before," she said, sharper now. "If there was a problem, you should have come to us." I didn't answer. The silence forced her to fill the space. She repeated herself louder, adding details that hadn't been questioned. Dates, assumptions, certainty, none of it slowed the process. The officer made a note and moved on. Denial stayed in the room longer than it should have, but it had already lost its footing. Confidence drained quickly once denial stopped working. Her voice rose. "This is ridiculous," she said, pushing her chair back. "You can't just take something like this away without discussion." She looked from the compliance officer to legal counsel, waiting for someone to correct the room. No one did. Her brother leaned forward, speaking over her now. "We can fix this," he said. "Whatever paperwork is missing, we'll sign it. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Legal counsel reminded him calmly that signatures after the fact didn't apply retroactively. She turned toward me again, eyes sharp. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. "To embarrass us, you could have handled this privately." I remained still. The panic shifted direction. Her tone softened, then tightened again. "We can adjust your pay. Change your title, you'll get what you want." The offers came faster, less organized. Numbers were mentioned, then walked back. When that didn't work, the edge returned. "This won't end the way you think it will," she said. "People remember things like this?" The compliance officer asked her to lower her voice. The room had changed. What had begun as authority now sounded like bargaining and then like threat. None of it altered the structure already in place. I spoke once only because the compliance officer looked in my direction. "This doesn't require discussion," I said evenly. "The process is already outlined." My voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. She started to respond, then stopped when legal counsel lifted a hand. The interruption wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. The kind that ends a line of argument without acknowledging it. I went quiet again. The pause that followed was heavier than anything that had been said. Papers sat untouched. No one checked their phone. Even the agency director stayed still, eyes on the document in front of him. When the compliance officer resumed, it was with confirmation, not explanation. The next steps were read aloud. Timelines were stated. Responsibilities were assigned. No one asked me another question. By the time the room settled, the authority had shifted completely, not through force or volume, but through alignment. The structure had finished closing around the outcome, and there was nothing left for anyone to push against. The final confirmations were handled without ceremony. Legal counsel summarized the outcome, referencing the clauses already reviewed. The compliance officer confirmed implementation dates and noted that all relevant departments would be notified before the end of the day. Access points would be adjusted automatically. Existing agreements would be suspended pending formal revision under the new authority. There was no vote, no request for consent. The agency director stated for the record that execution would begin immediately. His tone was neutral, almost routine, as if this were one of many procedural updates scheduled that morning. She tried once more to speak, then stopped when the officer continued without acknowledging her. The moment passed. The opportunity didn't return. A printed notice was slid across the table, face down. No one asked me to sign it. It wasn't required. Instructions were given about exits, follow-up communications, and points of contact. The meeting ended the way it had begun, quietly, efficiently, with the structure intact. As people stood, the space between us felt fixed, not hostile, final. What had been set in motion long before the meeting had finished doing its work, and there was no mechanism left inside the room to undo it. The first challenge came 2 weeks later, delivered through counsel and framed as a request for reconsideration. It was reviewed, acknowledged, and declined. The response cited the same provisions already confirmed in the meeting, with no additional commentary. A second attempt followed, this time more formal. Motions were filed, timelines were requested. The process moved forward exactly as outlined. Nothing was expedited, nothing was delayed. Each step resolved in sequence, documented, and closed. By the end of the month, the suspension of prior agreements was upheld. Temporary measures became standing ones. Authority remained where it had been placed, reinforced by written confirmation from multiple departments. There were no dramatic rulings or public statements. Just notices issued, systems updated, and access quietly adjusted. Vendor accounts reflected the changes first. Payroll followed. Internal communications updated titles and reporting lines without explanation. Every outcome traced back to something already on record. No new interpretations were introduced. No discretion was exercised in their favor. What had felt uncertain to them became routine to everyone else involved. Once the process began moving, it didn't pause again. It didn't need to. The matter continued forward without me present, governed by procedure rather than preference, until there was nothing left to contest. The effects showed up gradually, not all at once. Access changed before status did. Meetings they once led were reassigned. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls that used to be returned within minutes went unanswered for days, then not at all. People adjusted their distance carefully as if proximity itself had become a liability. By the next quarter, the contraction was visible. Administrative support was reduced. Long-standing arrangements were quietly dissolved. Vendors requested written confirmation for things that had previously been handled informally, then began routing communication elsewhere. Socially, the shift was cleaner. Apologies weren't offered. Explanations weren't requested. The circle narrowed without announcement. Events continued without them. Names were mentioned less often than not at all. None of this happened in front of me. I learned about it the way these things usually surface, through updates, forwarded notices, and brief references made in neutral conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It was orderly. Once authority moved, the environment adapted around it. Influence doesn't vanish loudly. It recedes step by step until there's nothing left to lean on. The confirmation arrived without commentary. It came as a short notice attached to a routine update, circulated to relevant parties and archived automatically. The language was formal and brief, listing effective dates, revised authority, and contact points going forward. No names were emphasized. No reasons were offered. A separate notice followed a week later, confirming that a pending review had concluded with no changes to the existing determinations. The file was marked closed. I read both once and saved them where the rest of the record was kept. Nothing else was required. No follow-up calls were scheduled. No explanations were requested. The process had reached its endpoint, acknowledged by people whose role was simply to confirm what was already settled. After that, the updates stopped coming. What stayed with me wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. Structures exist for a reason. When they're respected, they protect balance. When they're ignored, they correct it eventually. What happened wasn't punishment. It was alignment returning to a place where it had been quietly displaced. I continued working, this time with boundaries that were written, enforced, and understood. The systems I now operated within were transparent, and so were the expectations. Nothing needed to be negotiated after the fact. There's a difference between being underestimated and being invisible. One corrects itself when records are kept and processes are followed. The matter concluded without further discussion, and it stayed concluded.